Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. Honored to host it too as well. So I'm glad you guys are here. I was just joking that I got into a bad habit of not saving my talks and homilies because I thought it would help me to have to always develop new ones. This was a bad one not to save, I guess. Apparently, I didn't save my talk from when I gave it to St. Paul, but I've written some thoughts down, and hopefully it's helpful. I want it to be practical and maybe even a discussion. But I was looking at some things that Pope Benedict had written about music here. Not all that long ago, about 10 years ago, he wrote a document on sacred music and sacred liturgy. And he touched on how music is really very closely related to the liturgy in a way that we don't recognize many times in normal parish life, because how do you express the inexpressible? That's one of the realities that music develops so much in the Christian world, is because we understand that heaven and God is an inexpressible reality. He's an infinite reality. And how is it that we worship God? We worship God with words, but words are so inadequate that what happens is you burst into song. We're all familiar with St. Augustine's adage, when you sing, you pray twice. But why is that? One of the reasons is because it's difficult to express ourselves in words. We know that when you have a relationship with somebody, you love that person, you want to express to them how much you love them, it's difficult to do that in words, isn't it? And so song is often one of the ways that we try to do that. The song is the heart source with music. And so we've also probably heard the phrase that music is the language of heaven. Music is the language of heaven. And this is a big theme in one of my favorite authors, Dante's Divine Comedy. One of the realities in Dante's comedy, Dante goes through a journey through hell and then purgatory and up to heaven. Well, when he goes into hell, one of the things that Dante encounters is this horrible dissonance. What sounds awful, it's awful to his ears. Some of you probably have heard that maybe as musicians, you can relate to that image. Because when he goes into hell, everything is disordered. Everything is chaotic. And so there's no music because there's such dissonance. There's no mathematical organization. And so it's very hard on his ears. And it sounds awful. It's one of the tortures of hell in the Divine Comedy, is the lack of congruity. And so it's just very interesting that in our Christian culture, music has advanced so much precisely because we're trying to worship God. And we're trying to express what we really can't express very adequately with words. And so when Dante finally gets into heaven, he hears this the great sweet-sounding music, right? That everything is rationally ordered again. All creation is ordered. And music, we know, it's beautiful because there is a mathematical organization to it, and it's pleasing to our ears. And so music has always been very important in our Christian culture. And Pope Francis recently has said that music is also a form of evangelization. What is evangelization? It's the spreading of the gospel. And it is the trying to call back to Christian discipleship, that music can actually do that. That music can inspire people in that way. It has an incredible power and authority. Music is so important because it can inspire. We all listen to the radio, we hear a song that we like. It is inspirational. It can lift our mood. There's studies, scientific studies, not religious studies, that show us that music improves our moods, especially when we listen to music that we like. So there's really a powerful connection to our souls and to music. And that's one of the reasons that St. Augustine said that when we pray, or when we sing, we pray twice. That's one of the reasons. Pope Francis also said, too, he echoed that Dantean image, that music is the language of heaven, that it helps us to express what really is inexpressible, because the music along with the words. But one of the things I wanted to touch on today was why we sing, or when we sing, we pray twice, because of the nature of the Mass itself. And I'm sure all of you as musicians, and many future pastors know that when you get into parishes, you often encounter there's a lot of dissonance. Not maybe musical dissonance, but everybody has their different tastes and wants and desires. And music, instead of being a point of unification, can become a point of division. And that's very sad. It's very sad. And I think that one of the ways that we can begin to remedy that, if we really want to remedy it, and I'm preaching to myself here as much as to anyone, is that we have to really re-educate ourselves on the nature of the Mass. Because the music flows from the nature of the Mass. And that's why Christian music or Christianity plays such an important and decisive role in the development of all the great classical pieces of music. A lot of the classical pieces that we listen to were written for masses. So one of the things that we have to get back to is what is the essential nature of the Mass. And I think today we have this idea that we come to Mass to get something out of it for ourselves, right? If the homily's good, then that's a good Mass. Or if there's good music, then that's the Mass. But really, essentially, we have it backwards, I think. We have to re-educate ourselves about what the Mass is. I don't know if any of you are familiar with a man by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was actually one of Hitler's #1 enemies. But he escaped Germany. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer said that, or not Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer did not escape Hitler, excuse me. It was Dietrich von Hildebrand. He escaped, and I'm referring to Dietrich von Hildebrand here. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was the Lutheran pastor who did not get away from Hitler. But Dietrich von Hildebrand did, and he wrote a book on the liturgy, on the sacred liturgy, and he talked about what the Mass really is. And it's something we should have read in the seminary, because I think a lot of people would be surprised to learn that the Mass really is all about the glorification of God. And we've sort of reversed that about making it about us. That we can approach the Mass in a way that we have to be entertained, or that we have to, that's part of the homily, or the music in that way. And both of those things are important, no doubt. They're both important. But it's because they flow from the nature of the Mass, not the other way around. And I think we've kind of reversed those roles today in our society, and it's everywhere in the church that those things have to flow from what the Mass is. The Mass doesn't flow from the homily. It doesn't necessarily flow from the music either. Those things flow from what the Mass is in its very essence. And in its very essence, the Mass is the representation of Calvary. And that we are literally sitting at the foot of Calvary. And the Mass is not so much about us as it is about, first and foremost, glorifying God. And a secondary or derivative effect of that is that we are sanctified in that way. So the Mass is about Christ, and it's about God, and it's about the sacrifice that He made for us, and it's about glorifying that reality. And a consequence of that is that we are sanctified by that. But unfortunately, we've put the cart before the horse in many respects. I'm sure some of you can sense what I'm talking about there, that we have to get back to the education of what the fundamental nature of the Mass is. Because I think if we do that, we will, everything will start to flow back into proper order. Because I feel myself as a pastor, this is my second time being a pastor in a parish, it's very difficult to please everyone. And there's a certain distance that you can sense in every parish, in every diocese, in every world, in our country and in the whole world, that there is this level of discontent. You're never going to please everyone. And I think if we started to really educate ourselves on what the Mass is, and that starts from the pulpit, and that's really the priest's responsibility too to help do that. And so we do have to get priests more interested in the sacred liturgy. And I'll be the first to say that it's difficult to try to find time to apply, to dedicate to that. When you have a school and you're administrating a parish, we all want our priests to be more involved in the liturgy. No doubt about it, we do. But it can be very difficult to do that. Mary, I always give you all the time you ask for it, though, don't I? Because I'm a perfect priest. But all those other priests out there who don't do those things, it's very difficult to find the time to do that. And so I'm as guilty as anybody is wanting to do that, and it can be difficult in reality. But getting back to the fundamental nature of the liturgy, there's an old axiom from the fathers of the church that said lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi, which means the law of prayer, how we pray, shapes what we believe, and that will shape how we live our life. And how we live our life goes all the way back to how we pray. And so the fathers of the church said that our whole creed arose out of our prayer, how we pray. And so our creed that we recite on Sunday, for example, wasn't developed in its formula until 325, 3 centuries after the death of Christ, right? So the creed comes from how the church was praying and how the church understood God through prayer. And then that prayer shaped what we believe about God. And then what we believe is going to shape how we live. And that makes sense, right? Whatever I believe, that's how I'm going to live my life. And so if we apply that to the liturgy, that can give us some cues as to how things should look in the Mass as well. That it all begins with how we're praying. And what is one of the most essential ways that we pray, going back to St. Augustine, is with our music. Because we know that we have to somehow try to express the inexpressible. And as difficult as that is to do, music is the best way that we have to do that. Music is one of the most perfect ways that we can do that. But music causes a deep reflection just when we're listening to music that we like, secular music, as we're going down in our car or driving somewhere. It can evoke very powerful emotions, right? I mean, people can listen to a song and start crying because it brings back some memory or some event for them. So music touches the soul in a way that other things can't, precisely because it is something that's inexpressible. And Aristotle, he held that music affects us so deeply on that level, on an emotional level, precisely because it can affect our whole being. It can affect our mood. It can affect what we do. It can inspire us to do something that we don't want to do. Music can push us out of our comfort zone. So music can deepen the ardor of faith. And that's what Pope Francis is trying to get at when he talks about music as evangelization. Music as evangelization, because music can really deepen our faith. It can strengthen the ardor of faith. It's so inspirational. It's why people have praise bands, whatever we think of those. But, maybe outside of the liturgy at least, praise bands can be very, for example, inspirational in a certain context. Getting off topic on that a little bit, I'm reading a new book on about Annibale Benini. Anybody know who that is? A couple, 3 people probably do. Annibale Benini is a brand new book on his life. Annibale Benini is really the architect of the modern liturgy, the Novus Ordo Mass. He was very much behind the scenes at the Second Vatican Council, and he, for better or for ill, different opinions, had a very big influence on what our liturgy looks like today. He was very big on using the vernacular. He was very big on changing polyphonic Gregorian chant into something what he thought would be help in active participation in the liturgy. And one of the things about this book is that it really describes how our liturgy has become more secularized in a certain sense, that the cart got switched with the horse around that time of the Second Vatican Council. And I want to clear up maybe a myth on that, because many of you are familiar with Sacrosanctum Concilium, the Second Vatican Council's document on the liturgy, which is a very beautiful document. But what happened was, not that the Second Vatican Council intended to change the liturgy in this way, it happened after the Second Vatican Council, in the application of what was considered to be what the Vatican Council was asking for in the reforms of the liturgy. So when people think, we say, well, this is the Vatican II Mass, not really, because after Vatican II, the Pope set up a commission, a liturgical commission, to apply what the Second Vatican Council had asked for in the liturgy. Now, how many of you have read Sacrosanctum Concilium? Anyone read that document? Sacrosanctum Concilium, if you look at it, you'll go, what happened? What happened? Because it asks us to know all of the ordinary parts of the Mass in Latin and to be able to sing them. It did not ask that we, for example, turn the priest around. It did not ask that we changed completely everything into the vernacular, certainly the readings and the homily. But the liturgy from the Second Vatican Council, if we would have probably enacted the reforms as the Second Vatican Council asked us to, our liturgy would look very different. But I want to clear up that it wasn't the Second Vatican Council really that changed the Mass. It was the commission that was set up afterwards to apply those norms that really took some major, probably exaggerations in the liturgy. And this book is very interesting. It just came out in English edition. And I recommend it because it gives you some insight into what actually happened at the Second Vatican Council. But the Second Vatican Council, the documents are very beautiful, and it called for a simple, really a simplification of the liturgy, not the drastic change that we saw happen. And I think one of the reasons we feel such dissonance in our parishes and in our culture, in our dioceses throughout the world today, is precisely because of that radical change. That Pope Benedict would call it, that wasn't an organic change, it was a very drastic change. And that drastic change has really changed how we live our life. This is a great way to help understand that axiom of the Fathers of the Church. What we believe is going to, how we pray is ultimately going to change how we live. And I don't think that any of us have to look very far to think things have changed how we live our life. It doesn't. And so there's a lot of liturgical theologians who would say, because the Mass was changed in kind of a drastic and immediate and organic fashion, that it really did change how people live. And you think, well, that seems a little abstract. How is that even possible? But the reality is, what was the one thing that was unchangeable for most Catholics? What was the one thing that everybody thought would never change?
The Eucharist?
The Mass, right? The Mass. I mean, the Mass for 1,600 years was codified in that way. I mean, that was kind of the unchangeable for most Catholics. Right? They go to Mass, and they can depend, no matter where they go, if they go to Africa or if they go to Mass at St. James in Augusta, it looked the same. And one of the things that this book that I'm reading about, Annibale Benini, sheds light on is that some of the African cardinals, for example, were a little discontent because they weren't allowed to give their cultural expression in the liturgy, because it truly was the same everywhere in Mass. They Romanized even the church in Africa. You know, we think of all the liturgical dance that you see when you go to Africa today, for example, or part of their culture, their cultural expression. And there needs to be room for cultural expression, but what happened was when we disunify, in a certain sense, we create a dissonance. And so the Mass is not always the same now. I mean, the essence of the Mass is there, if the priest says the valid words of consecration, but there is a kind of discontent now. That you can go to Mass somewhere and it might not be exactly the same. And that's really not our Catholic background or our Catholic understanding. What does the word Catholic mean? It means universal. That everything is the same. No matter where I go, if I go to Mass here, or if I go to Mass there, it's the Mass. And that was one of the reasons the Church prized Latin so much, was because it was the universal language. That's why the Pope today still celebrates Mass in Latin when they're countries of all over the world represented at the Vatican will celebrate Mass in Latin, so that we don't favor any one particular language, because it was and still is the universal language of the Church. Whenever documents come out, they're expressed first in Latin, because Latin doesn't change the way that English changes, or the way that we have, for example, if you were to tell Abraham Lincoln, man, that's really cool, he'd be like, that's cold? How's that cold? But in English, we can change the meanings of words, whereas in Latin, there really is no change in the definition of something. It remains the same. That's why the Church issues documents first in Latin, and then we can screw them up after that in all of our different languages as we translate them. But that's what happened in our liturgy. That's why Pope Benedict issued the reform for only the English-speaking countries. It was only in English that we had botched the translation so bad. So it's because in Spanish and Italian, all the Romance languages, there was no need to retranslate the Mass, because it was, and with your spirit, for example. So the word consubstantial was used in So it's that nature of Latin that does have a place in the life of the church. It does have a place in the life of the church. Now, practically speaking, we are far from that now, aren't we? I mean, the Second Vatican Council closed in 1965, and by 1969, Mass was changing every day. First, they had a hybrid missal, and then, I don't remember that. I'm not old enough for that. I shaved my beard, I was like 14. But I don't remember any of that. But I heard about it, and I actually had someone give me a hybrid missal one time because they knew I liked the liturgy. But it was interesting. One side was English, and one side was Latin, and you never knew what was going to happen because every year they were issuing a new missal because there was some experimentation going on. And then finally in 1970 was when we got our English translation of Mass. And then in, 2011, I think, was when Pope Benedict asked that we retranslate that and make it more faithful to the original Latin. So one of the things I would say too about music is that it is a source of conflict in parishes, as I mentioned. And that's what that book illustrated for me so well, was to show how that even on a very international level, on a world stage, how does that play out? And what can we do in our parishes, in normal parishes? How can we improve our music and our liturgy? That's a conversation that I think has to happen, because how we pray does affect how we live. We can see that so clearly today. It's so evident that when you change something so fundamental as the Mass, you're going to change what Catholics ultimately believe and how they live. And one of the sad realities is what I don't know if you know, one of the more recent statistics on Catholics who believe in the real presence of the Eucharist. It's very disappointing. It's less than 30% now that actually believe that the Eucharist really is the body and blood of Jesus Christ, not a symbol, that it is in its essence the body and blood of Christ. Well, how did that happen? If you would have taken that poll in 1940 or 1950, that wasn't the case. Is it really just the revolution of the 60s? I don't think so. I think you can make a good case for when you change how you pray, when you change how people pray, you change what they believe. And when you change what they believe, you will change how they live their life. And that is something that has to be rediscovered in our church today. And I think it is being rediscovered, that we're trying to get back to our roots. For example, being at St. Paul was very helpful for me, and being in college ministry, I was able to see that young people really hunger for tradition. You know, we think we know what they want. And I know a lot of our, only the NPM is going to watch this, right? Because a lot of our board members, for example, would say, we need to do this at the Mass, right? We need to have saxophones and electric guitars and things like that. Because that's what they think they want. And we force our categories of thought on them. And that's not what they want. And it's hard for them to imagine that, because I don't have the experience that they had in growing up in all of that change. I mean, it probably was very confusing. I can't even imagine. You know, one day you go to Mass, it's in Latin, next day in English. Next day you're, using one word in Latin, the next one's in English or something. I mean, it was changing. But they also had this feeling that some of those changes were good and some of them were good. But now we're kind of forcing that on maybe our young people, and we think we know what they want, when in reality, they really do hunger for the root to get back to the identity. And I think one of the reasons they want that is because they're inundated with secular, in our secular culture, they're just totally drowning in it. We're like turkeys, in the rain. You just drink it in, and when they go to church, they want something that's different. They actually want something that's different because it touches on their soul. And so when we would do things like at St. Paul, during Lent, for example, we would try to get back to the antiphonal, singing with a song, and we used the organ. The kids loved that. They liked it a lot because it was different from what they heard every single day. And it put them in touch with a transcendent reality. And that's why music is metaphysical. Metaphysical in the sense that it allows us not only to express the inexpressible, but the word metaphysics means above nature. And music has that ability to put us in touch with something that's transcendent, that's otherworldly. And so those kids, they really enjoyed that traditional nature of the liturgy. We didn't do a lot of Latin or anything like that, but it was different from what their normal experience every day was. You know, we weren't playing Christina Aguilera at Mass, and they liked that. It wasn't something that they were looking for when they come for Mass. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind as pastors and as musicians, that we do have to keep in mind our young people today too, because of the radical shift in culture. And when they come to Mass, it should be something that is otherworldly, something that is set apart. That's why music is sacred at Mass. The word sacred means to be set apart. It's not what happens every day. It should be very different from what they encounter. We talk about our church as being portals of heaven. Well, in order to do that, when we walk outside of the church, it doesn't always feel like heaven when we go back to our lives. And we really want the Mass to be a point of contact with God. So somehow we have to find ways to set it apart from everything else. And I'm not saying that we can't use guitars or that we can't use, I'm saying we can't use saxophones personally. I don't think we should be using saxophones. But John Paul II would say the same thing, that John Paul II said that really if it's something that is used in a secular way, radically, then it really doesn't have a place in the liturgy. Because the liturgy, the very nature of the liturgy is supposed to be otherworldly. The difficulty, I think, for us is the pastoral versus the theoretical. There's a great disillusionment for priests, for example, just as I'm sure there is with you in working with priests. There can be a disillusionment. But in the seminary, my first 4 years, I'm a modern-day lifer. The old lifers seminary, they went to high school seminary, college seminary, theology school. I went to college seminary at Conception Avenue, Missouri. It's totally out in the middle of nowhere. I don't know if any of you have been there. They have a beautiful pipeline in there, a beautiful basilica. But at Conception, I thought, man, people spend 12 years of their life there. Back in the day, 4 years of like Father Terry Bede and some of the other priests, they did 4 years of high school seminary there, 4 years of college seminary, 4 years of theology school, all at Conception. And I only did 4 years I went right after high school, because there's no such thing as college high school seminary anymore. So I did my 4 years there and 4 years at the Josephina. And in the seminary, liturgy is very pristine. It's perfect. There's never any real mess-ups. You're dealing with older servers, and everything is orderly. And when you get into a parish, you discover, oh my God, it's not like that. And people are crying. And you don't have that in the seminary either. So there can be a real disillusionment, I think, for priests and getting into the practical parts of ministry. And so while we do want to take into account that there are certain practical things that we have to consider, one of the dangers is letting go of the theoretical and the goal, I guess, so to speak. I think one of the great contributions of Pope Francis to the church today is reaching where people are and not expecting them to be somewhere they're not. But the whole idea of reaching out to someone where there is to take them farther, right? We don't want to just reach out to them and leave them where they are. We want to reach out to them and take them farther along. And I think sometimes we think that we're so far gone, we forget the goal. We're going to reach down where people are and just stay there and be happy there. And we have to, and change is hard. I've learned that. Change is very difficult in a parish. People don't like change. Did you know that? I didn't know that. I discovered. So I think that's why we have to begin with what is the Mass. And to really preach about that, and to talk about that, to educate about that. Because when people understand what the Mass is, first and foremost, that it really is about glorifying God and not so much about whatever it is that I want to take away from it. It's not even about the homily. It's not so much about that. It's about me worshiping God. It's about God being glorified. I think that will change our how people look at music and what they're willing to do and not do. We don't want to learn new songs, for example, because it's too hard, or a new Mass setting because it's too difficult. But the reality is, if we understood what the Mass was, we'd put everything into it if we could. And we don't want to spare any expense in that regard. That's why we have beautiful churches. A lot of people say, well, if we just sell off those things and give it to the poor. But it's the beauty, it's the transcendental beauty that helps put us in contact with the most important reality, God. And so when we go to church, it's supposed to be beautiful. And not that it isn't, but it's supposed to be completely set apart, something so transcendent. So my question, I think, as a pastor is, okay, well, the goal over here is polyphonic Gregorian chant. All right? But, you know, this isn't polyphonic Gregorian chant. And how do we balance the pastoral needs with the goals and desires of the church, the true goals and desires of the church? By the way, I think the worship hymn was a very good hymn. That's why we chose it. But I do think that there is a place for the polyphonic Gregorian chant, or at least some chant. But how do you introduce that into a normal parish setting? It can be very difficult. And I'm sure Mary would be beating her head against the wall trying to figure out how to do that, as I would too. And I'd be interested just for a moment to hear, as we talk about this dissonance that is going on in our parishes and in our dioceses in regards to music, your experience a little bit about that too. Because as musicians, you also experience that disconnect between what the church really desires and what the ability, we think the ability of the people is, because we don't challenge too much. Is that true? Does that make sense? Anybody want to share an experience or anything in that regard? Okay.
I was in Colorado Parish
Okay.
for 6 years, and just as I was leaving, they introduced the Belmont Mass. Well, then it was about a year later that I came back just to visit. That parish, they were raising me. They learned it, they loved it, and it was just perfect.
So that's an example of, yeah.
But they had a very good choir director, the music director, was studied for his doctorate in opera.
So they really work to educate the people about the Mass and the music, yeah.
Yes, and they had classes. I mean, I still got the emails tonight's the history of Gregorian chant.
Wow, that's really awesome.
It was
How many priests do they have in that parish?
just one.
Really? Does
Yes.
the priest do a lot of the education? Do they have school?
No, not yet.
Okay.
But they have one. It's just they built a new church.
That's really cool.
They're doing phase two.
Okay.
And then it's finished because it's from.
Father Urach is at Church of the Magdalene. We started a Sunday evening Mass just kind of out of the blue last June. It's an a cappella Mass. It's a little scary, or at least enough. Half of it is, right? Half of it. But
Half of it's
so,
scary or half
well,
of it's not?
half of the Mass. I mean, it's alternating Sundays.
I see.
So I sing the a cappella, I lead the a cappella masses with simple English propers. So at the entrance of the priest, it's a solo. Because I haven't got a schola yet. Nobody's got guts enough to join me. And a communion as well. However, then to calm that down, yes, the priest is Ade Orientam, and yes, it's a Latin Mass. We're going to be singing the Belmont Mass, which is very chant-like. Very rich, it's easy learned. But we have 2 hymns of the usual sort of congregational hymn. You got to pick carefully. Not all hymns work a cappella out of the hymnal, but we have several hundred people every Sunday. It still blows my mind. I thought, who would come to this?
Well, it is a
that's those
supper,
300
right?
people.
Not breakfast, but, you know.
Well, it is
still-
Sunday evening. It's kind of like your choices are getting limited. You can go here or, but
Sunday evening masses are.
Sunday evening is fine.
Very popular.
there.
But that's really cool that they're trying to do something different. And,
Yeah. So I'm seeking, no one said, join me, please. I need some more help. Do a schola for the proper.
When you bring up the antiphons and the Psalms, I touched on it a bit earlier. The Psalms, you know, we do have a Judeo-Christian heritage in the Psalms of David. Actually, I'm partial to Joseph Jones. I love the Jelly Song Tones. Joe does a great job, and Harold singing those too. And we're starting to do those too, the Jelly Song Tones. I don't know if you are familiar with those. They really keep, there's an article in First Things magazine about how they really keep and preserve the Hebraic style of poetry, how they would have sounded in singing the Psalms, the Psalms of David, how they would have sang these Psalms. And so Joseph Jellier is a French composer, and he composed these psalm tones. They are a little challenging. They are. They just really are. They're very different from what maybe we have sung in the past. But the Psalms are meant to be sung, and they're part of our liturgical heritage as well. And the Psalms, I think you guys have been listening or will listen to the Mind-Rad chant tones. Is that correct? Maybe you already have later today. I really encourage you to listen. They're very beautiful. But this because the Psalms are meant to, not just the Psalm at the responsorial Psalm, but the Psalms were used in our hymns. At the very beginning, at the introit, that's what was sung as the ministers processing at the Mass. We often sing them at the cathedral for liturgy's Psalms, because they are part of our liturgical heritage. So singing is just very much a part of our liturgical heritage, but also even in our Jewish brothers and sisters, Christianity rising out of Judaism, the Psalms are meant to be sung in all parts of the Mass. The introit, communion, offertory. We've gotten into hymns, and that's okay. Hymns are beautiful too. But I think if we can start introducing some of our heritage, that will help us to express us the nature of the Mass. And there are some things that we just have to not be ashamed of. For example, the church still never has changed. The primary instrument that the church requests is organ. The organ holds a prime place in the life of the church because it is so majestic. I love John Paul I. He was only Pope for 34 days. I don't know if any of you have read much of there's some new books on his life, and I've always admired John Paul I. I find him to be, I hope he's going to be a saint one day soon. I think he already is a saint. But John Paul I wrote that when he was a little boy, he walked into the church and he heard the pipe organ playing, and he thought he was a little prince. That it had the ability to really evoke this emotional sense in him, that it's something majestic and very otherworldly, which is why the church does prefer that particular instrument. And to even say that is scary. I don't want to get stoned or anything, but it is true that the church does have preferences to help express the reality of the Mass and also to help us worship. And we have to not be afraid of those. It doesn't mean that we can't play the piano or that we can't use guitars. All of that is fine. But I do think we have to look at what does the church ask of us, because the church has 2,000 years of experience in helping us to worship God. And the Mass is the primary place that we worship God. It's the most perfect prayer. So we have to be willing to give everything and all to the Mass. I know one of the things that I talked about, Tom asked if there was anything else that Charlene that when I talked last time. I really wish I would have saved that, Tom. But
It was good.
I just lost my train of thought for a second. I was going to say the hymns that we sing. I know that I believe I'd rather almost shorten the homily and finish a hymn, because the hymns do tell a story. That's part of the evangelization of music, Pope Francis speaks about, is that, if we're singing, I lost the name of the song off the top of my head, the one that we sang just a Sunday ago, it was a beautiful song, about morning, noon, and the evening, and at night. What's the Song of Hopefulness, Lord of all hopefulness. If you stop, and then, in the morning, it's a little strange. You want to finish the song, because it speaks about, making our whole day a prayer, right? Making our whole day a prayer. It's one of the reasons the priest prays the divine office. We shouldn't sit down and pray our whole office all at one time in the morning. Evening prayer at 8 a.m. The idea is to sanctify each part of the day. You pray morning prayer, daytime prayer, evening prayer, and night prayer at the proper times. Well, the hymns themselves, too, are meant to tell a story when we just kind of off all the time. it is unfortunate because they're very beautiful and they do tell stories. They're not all beautiful, but some of them, many of them are. And, you know, when the priest hits the chair, I know a lot of priests want to just, you're done, you know, or they'll give a scowl or something like that. But I think we try to make it a habit here, for example, and maybe it's something you can bring up to your pastors or priests to say, would it be possible, especially when a hymn tells a story? Now, ideally, I would sit down with our director of music and really plan out the theming during our weekday passes for the school. I want to get to where we're doing that, to make the music really fit the liturgy of the day, and that the priest is involved with that too. That's the ideal. And I know a lot of priests probably don't want anything to be involved with that. It's really unfortunate. I think if you can encourage them and make it not so scary, but to let them know that, you know, this hymn actually tells a story. And I know you want us to cut us off when we hit the chair, but it's a good idea that if we can complete the song, it does tell the story of what we're trying to do. And it would probably be better than record the homilies and finish the hymn rather than do it the other way around. You know, preach for 30 minutes and then say Eucharistic prayer. So I think that we have to get some balance back into the liturgy. I think that's the idea. And if we can get back to what the nature of the Mass is, I think that's my point, then a lot will flow back from that. And I think that Pope Benedict and Pope Francis and Pope John Paul II really were trying to get us back to the nature of the Mass. And it takes, they say, 100 years after a council, after an ecumenical council, to kind of, for the pendulum to swing back into what the council actually desired. And we're not at 100 years yet for the Second Vatican Council. So there is some patience that we have to have with people and with the church too. Because it's not just the musicians, all the priests have a fundamental role that sometimes we neglect. And as priests, that really should be one of our primary realities, not, you know, calling a plumber for a broken urinals, but that we are actually trying to get involved in bettering the liturgy and being involved in the planning and execution of it. Yes? Well, I am very partial to it. I took Old Testament from Abbot Gregory Fuller. Yeah, and so I like the translation. I think it's I guess to me it does have a transcendental nature to it. It's very much more literal translation, but it also is you have to stop and think about it sometimes because of the way it's worded. And that too to me is very beautiful. Asking about the new translation of the Psalms because sometimes we can water down our translations so much, and it puts us into contact with something that's a very deep part of our history. And I think as Catholics, that's one of the things that we have to really challenge ourselves to do. Sometimes liturgical experts today are only knowledgeable from 1965 on. And that's not a liturgical expert. A liturgical expert, and I'm not one, would understand the whole breadth of the history of the Church, the contribution of the Church to culture, and the place of Christianity and music, and how closely intertwined they are. That is really a liturgical expert, someone who isn't just focused on what's happened in the last 75 years, but we have a whole tradition that we have.
Where there's on soil songs, not the conception happy sometimes. I do have those. And that's not as kind.
Well, he's still out of practice.
Anyway, we use a publication of GRA written by Michael Bernard, who is a Canadian, and he has sent all of the Grail translation to and they're very, very nice.
I think that we don't tell.
I didn't catch what the translation was, the name, was it?
The person who translated the Psalms?
Yes.
Gregory Poland.
Gregory
Poland. Poland.
Name. Didn't catch it.
He's a former abbot at Conception Abbey. Before I wrap up, is there any other questions that we can entertain for a few minutes? Questions or thoughts or things you want to bring up, or is something I mentioned that I don't recall from my previous talk.
What are your thoughts on when the communion song should be finished? Do they wrap up and you sit down? Or could they go on until they, just your own personal thoughts? Go on until the song is finished, or you want to find a stopping place to stop?
Well, I think ideally, that you would finish the song or whatever it is that we're doing. Communion literally means that we're all doing this together and that we're all in communion with one another. That's why it's unfortunate when some people sing, other people don't sing. The idea is that we are all, praying together. But I think it's better if you can finish the song, not just make a unnatural cutoff. It's no one would ask you to do that in an opera or play. You're like, you want to finish what it is. It's an art. It's a piece of art, And the music is artistry. That's very best. And so you just cut it off. It doesn't always make sense.
What about the recession? The priest reaches the end of the doors. I've heard that basically you shouldn't continue the song after he reaches.
Well, that's not correct. I mean, that's the priest's personal preference. And that's where, I know you guys are limited sometimes, and the priest says that. I don't think we have a hard and fast rule on that. I mean, if it seems like there's 8 more verses to go, and the priest is behind, well, maybe, yeah. But ideally, that you would finish the song. I try to stay up here for about 3 verses, or 4 verses, and then go out on about the last verse, to finish the song.
What it seems like at our church.
And we're always done in less than an hour.
It seems like there's one of the choir directors that thinks as soon as the priest sits down at the communion, he's got to wrap it up.
Well, probably because the priest has said
I don't
that.
want to go past the doors, but I've been at other masses, with the same priest, and they sit down, and the choir, the individuals still singing, they keep singing, and sometimes, it goes a minute or more, because there's one of them that's got it in his head that they're not supposed to sing after the priest reaches the door, and they're supposed to cut it off as soon as he sits down after the communion.
And it may not be the priest.
I don't know what's written.
Well, what's written, I think, is that these songs tell stories, and the idea is that, again, that's the theoretical, the perfect idea would be to complete the song, to complete the story. But I think this is why getting back to the nature of the Mass is so important, because the choir directors and the priests also can see a certain restlessness in people because they don't understand why we're still doing it. So we're both caught between a rock and a hard place. That the practical and pastoral implications are that in not educating people on what the Mass is, there's this restlessness. Why are we still sitting here? Father's done. It's practical. I mean, isn't it true? Like, the practical, we think of the Mass as something practical, but it's not supposed to be practical. We know what's truly beautiful is not practical, actually. One theologian said that one of the greatest things about us is that we're useless to God. That doesn't sound like a compliment. You're useless. But it is a compliment because if we could give God back something, He wouldn't love us for just who we are. It's because He would love us because of what we're doing for Him. God doesn't need us to worship Him. He doesn't need us to praise Him. He doesn't get a big divine head by us being on our knees or, grow in some kind of egotistical fashion like that. The fact that we are useless to God is one of the most beautiful things about our theology. He loves us for us. And what we do at Mass is not supposed to just be practical. It's supposed to express that reality. There should actually be an impractical nature to Mass. Like Guardini and a lot of the liturgical theologians around the time of the Second Vatican Council talked about the playfulness of the liturgy, that it's supposed to be not just this practical, let's get through it and be done with it. Let's go to Mass early so we can get on with our day, kind of a thing. But that is time not wasted, but time given away to God. And that's, if we can somehow re-educate everybody on that reality, but it's very difficult to do because especially in our age when I myself can't hardly keep my phone down for an hour. It really has changed our ability to concentrate. And it also, you can see the shifting of people in the pews and the restlessness. So, you know, the poor musicians and also the priests are looking out and they see that restlessness. But if somehow we can get back to that, to understanding that it's okay that it's not practical. We don't have to shut down as soon as the priest sits down. That you get into really what the nature of the liturgy is really about.
Thank you.
Jim.
You can probably say this more elegantly than I, but along that vein, and you were talking about the pendulum swings in centuries and millennia, we have little pendulum swings as well. I survived 5 bishops and 5 rectors, and the pendulum does swing, and what we were just talking about, we each of us need to have our own philosophy, our own vision. With any luck, we can talk with the current pastor, sometimes not, but he's not going to be there forever. Yeah, you may die before he does,
That's
but
a very good point.
put that into something elegant, because you're a much better speaker than I am.
Yeah, it's hard on priests, of course, moving, but it's also hard on the people to go from one priest to another, and these very different personalities. Sometimes we can't be more opposites than one another. And you guys stay. This is, your parish, not all of you, but this is your parish, not my parish. And I think again, I don't want to repeat myself or flog a dead horse. This is why it is so essential that we start rediscovering the essence and nature of the Mass. Not what we want it to be, but what it actually is. Because what happens is, it shouldn't be, oh, Father changes, and so now we have to do it this way all the time. Or the bishop changes, and now we have to do this. Because that's the beauty of the Catholicity of our faith, right? That there is a certain sameness, things that you can depend upon, principles that we should be able to apply everywhere, no matter where we are. And unfortunately, that's not the case because we approach the Mass with the cart and the horse reversed. It's what I want, my preference. And again, I would challenge myself on this as much as any priest too, because you can say, I want this, or I want to do it this way. But my hope and my goal personally is that I'm operating off of the principles of what the Church asks of us, not what my own personal preferences are. Because I think if we can apply those, then that cuts down on the little pendulum swings that we have all the time. But we're a long way away from that. But we have to start at some point. We have to start at some point, because Jim is right, there are these little pendulum swings that aren't about just Second Vatican or ecumenical councils, but on personalities. And that's the last thing the liturgy is supposed to be about, is a personality. Right? It's not about Father John A. or Father John Urach or Father or Bishop Kimmy. It's not about that. It's about Jesus Christ. That's what was so beautiful about teacher John Hildebrand reminding us. The first and primary purpose of the Mass is the worship of God. It's not about you or me. And I think that's shocking to a lot of people to hear that the Mass is not about me. I thought, wow, I'm supposed to walk away with something, and if I don't, I'm going to go to another church. But that's why that we have to start talking about the uselessness in a way to let people know that God doesn't love us because of something we can give Him. He loves us because of who we are. And we have to be able to, when you spend time with people that you love, you're not always looking at the watch or doing something practical. Isn't it the same with God if it's a real relationship? And that's really what the liturgy is ultimately about. And there's a natural nature to that. You don't have to try to make it less than an hour. Consciously, it can happen if we just apply the principles that the Church gives us.
So maybe you can glean some help for a situation that we have at St. Anne's. We have we have 2 Spanish masses and 3 English masses, and so I've been hearing Father talk about, that he's been wanting to do, just the chant mass, some Latin, But he says, you know, some of the parishioners have actually left because they started doing Latin. So when the choir director mentioned to me, you know, she's talking about the Latin Mass, I thought, hey, this is a perfect opportunity. So I went back to Father. I said, okay, hey, we need to jump into this and do it, you know, for Lent because it's good for your bilingual masses. We do a lot of bilingual masses, and you know, then we can use the universal language, you know, of the church, Latin, in order to do those bilingual masses and all that. So I, you know, also said to Father, so we need to educate the people because I said you don't want people not going, you know, quitting the church over singing. I guess it's St. Anne's have never even done the chant mass, and so we did with the English people. I sent out.
And that's not
We
a lot of parishes don't do that. You know?
Well, most of the parishes I've been in, which are for Lent or for Advent, you know, we've done the chant mass. So I was a little bit surprised that they not done.
Okay, you mean like the song twos and
Yes.
Understood.
Yes. And so we were going to do that just for Lent. We're still planning on it. Yeah. So anyway, I did get information out, and a couple articles out to the English musicians, you know, and a little bit why we want to do that. But now my Spanish musicians, the Spanish musicians are really upset about it, and they're threatening to leave.
has Father been willing to get in there? And
Father's willing to, you know, I texted him yesterday, I said, please call this certain musician, you know, and he said he would, and, you know, we're on it. But I'm just saying, how do we do? I think because they learn a lot of the music by rote, and so it's difficult. Plus, a lot of new Spanish liturgy has come out, and so Father wants to do the Spanish. So we have started the new mass, which they're not fully gotten into yet. And so then to say, okay, we're going to do Latin, which they're not used to.
Right.
I've even I've offered to come and help and to, you know, to teach the people. But, you know, there's
I don't know that I have any like magical advice. I think maybe if the priest is willing to invest himself into educating the whole congregation.
well, he's
to
going to
like-
do video. We have videos of this, so he's going to do a couple of videos a couple of weeks before the Latin, and then we're going to have the
Like videos?
slides. We have videos. We have slides and we have videos.
I gotta do videos. I'm very-
In fact, Father's really good at it. He's really good at education, you know. I mean, he's very, very talented in that. I said, you need to do this because you're really good at it. He said, thank you. I said, no, you really are good at it. So he'll do it, you know. But
I think that's going to help a lot, is if the priest is
what
willing
if we
to
lose our
enter.
Spanish musicians before we ever do it? We have, I know that's scary.
It is here. Yeah, and you do have to start somewhere, you know. We can't be afraid to make changes because we're going to lose people. It is, I think that the changes are done lovingly and from the principles of the church, and the priest is willing to help explain them. If they're a radical change like that, maybe, from what the norm is, all those things will help. But that's why, I mean, how many of you think, for example, that most people walking through the doors on Sunday realize that the Mass is primarily, first and foremost, about the glorification of God? Wouldn't you think that most people, if you were to take a poll, think that the Mass is about what I get from it? Is that true? So, that's one of the most challenging things that you all have that are dealing with, I think, is a lack of education from the Second Vatican Council. Truly, that time period on, there has been a huge deficiency in catechism and in catechetical explanation. We have an uncatechized generation. And I have heard Father's very good about catechesis and explaining that. I think we have to explain the Mass primarily, because everything we do as Catholics, we believe, revolves around that. So if you can get people to understand that, I think they're willing to try things if they understand what that is and why we're doing it, rather than change for change's sake. And I think that's a lot of our approach is, oh, well, this is just change for change's sake. It's the newest novelty. Let's try it out. And that's the last thing that the church is really about, supposed to be about. There certainly are parishes that do it that way, and that's not good. It's not operating off of our organic history and our Catholic heritage. We have a very beautiful and long sacred tradition, and that's what we have to get our people back in touch with. And you wouldn't have the leaving and going, and there's a kind of sameness everywhere. That's the danger of, even though there are different cultures, when we diverge so much from the unity of the church, that's where all this dissonance comes in. There does have to be room for cultural expression, and I don't have some perfect answer for that. I'm glad I don't have to, try to resolve those issues, because I don't know how to. I don't know how do you allow for the cultural expression of worship in Africa to, Rome, Italy, to St. James, Augusta. It's very difficult. It's a very difficult question, but I think the church prizes unity over diversity in that particular sense. At least I haven't found anything to be contrary to that.
See, I haven't done any education yet with the Spanish musicians because of the other new mass that they're learning, and I don't want to overwhelm them. And Father said, okay, even if they just give the last 4 weeks of Lent, we'd be fine. I said, that'd be fine. Then it's a nice start on the Latin Mass. That it becomes this big when it's less than 4 minutes of music. The chant Mass is less.
But when you talk about Latin, I love my parents, by the way, but when I talk to them about the Latin Mass, for example, they'll say, I didn't need that. I didn't understand anything. I don't understand it.
Then they picture the priest turning around and
And it's true. You don't understand. Most people don't have a speaking knowledge of Latin, right? I don't have that facility in Latin. I can read it, pray it, and know what I'm saying, but I can't have a conversation in Latin. So, how do you educate them people about, the priests used to whisper the canon of the Mass. Before the reforms of the Liturgy of the Novus Ordo, that canon of the Mass represented the priest entering into the Ark of the Covenant, and only the priest entered into that. Well, whispering the canon of the Mass was a way that the church showed that this was a conversation between Christ and the Father. That the Mass is really the representation, and only Christ can offer that perfect sacrifice to the Father. And whispering the canon of the Mass actually emphasized that reality. But suddenly we stopped catechizing about that. And so if you were to do that today, for example, to whisper the canon, people would go, what's wrong? What's happened? I can't understand you, Father. I can't hear you. But that all goes back to my first principle of the nature of the Mass. We talk about that and educate people about that. Wow, there's so many powerful things I think that we could do. There's so many neat things that we could do. Not necessarily going back to whispering the canon, but I think you'll find that people would be much more willing to try things that seem impractical. To get back to the principles of the church. Or maybe I'm living in a happy land.
Father, I always thought, like you said, we have all this wealth of beautiful music that came from the past and things that we can't. We have that music now because of people that had that attitude of, I want to give and I want to create to give to God. So they created all this beautiful music back then, and that's because people went to church with that attitude. We're going to give the best we can to God. And like you said, we've kind of gotten away from it. Now it's what am I going to get from Mass? If I don't get anything out of it, it's a waste of time to go. But if you want people to give, then when the people are saying, we don't know anything about Latin, so why are we going to a Mass to give a Latin Mass? We don't understand it. We can't participate. So they don't feel like they're giving anything because they don't understand it. So, I understand that's why you have to teach them.
Yeah.
But the purpose of the Latin was at a time when people read Latin. People spoke in Latin at the time. The church was more prominent then, and people knew the Latin.
Well,
the Spanish Masses, the people
actually they didn't. The common man did not understand Latin.
But
even the vulgar Latin of the church, it's called priests really.
Yeah, and your choir members that were trained by the priests. And then the common people didn't do anything. They
That's right.
kind of sat in mass and listened and prayed and said, what a wonderful, glorious sound. And you run into that a lot now, today too. People that, well, let's just let the musicians do it, what a wonderful, glorious sound. I don't know how to do it, I'll just sit back and pray. And then they wonder why they don't get anything out of it. Because they're not participating, which is why I always understood that when Vatican II came around, they were trying to get people more involved in the participation, to feel like they were contributing to the actual mass parts.
And that's even from Pius X, long before Second Vatican Council. He was very big on trying to get people to understand what active participation really means. And I think the definition that people have today of active participation is, I have to be doing something. I have to always be doing something to participate. And that's not necessarily what active participation means liturgically, but it means uniting ourselves to what is happening now.
Exactly. So when we have Spanish-speaking people who will sing for the Spanish mass parts to actively participate continually, then it's a question of getting them to understand that I have to learn the Spanish parts that you're going to sing at your mass, so when it comes time for the Latin, you have to learn the Latin. And so we can both contribute to the mass, whether we're doing the Latin mass or we're doing the Spanish mass.
Well, everybody has to do the Latin. The English people have to do the Latin too.
Right.
I'm not particularly happy about it either, so.
But if we're going to participate in the mass, then we have to learn which, depending on what season and what your musicians have chosen for the season, if you've chosen to do a more traditional chant mass, then everybody has to figure out a way to participate. The hard part is getting people willing to learn to do it.
Well, a lot of this really should shoulder, the priest has to shoulder a lot of responsibility because he has the microphone and able to really educate and to even preach about it sometimes. I think some of the, not to no names, but I've heard, for example, priests will go back to the Autorientum, for example. And I find Autorientum, but you have to explain that. You have to tell people why. What is the tradition there? What does that actually mean? Is the priest turning his back on the people? Or is the priest turning towards God? What does that really mean? When you just do something, this is what actually happened after the Second Vatican Council with the Liturgical Commission. They just threw these changes at people with no explanation. And I would get frustrated sometimes with priests around that era who lived through that. They don't want to go back to that. They don't realize that those changes were thrust on people too with no explanation. And we have a tendency to do that today too, that we can just thrust change on people with absolutely no explanation. And that's a big change, talking about Autorientum or going into Latin and doing, like if we were to go all the ordinary parts of Latin, parts of Mass back to Latin, I think I would have a responsibility to talk to the people about it. Many times over.
And that's the complaint online. I read stuff, and that's the complaint of the people online, is that, they just throw this Latin on us, and we don't know why we're doing it, what it is, and there's no basically they're saying there's no education.
And I think those are the two things that I would like to, when I was mentioning, the theoretical versus the pastoral. We don't want to neglect either one. They're both important. The theoretical, with the church, seems more abstract from maybe everyday parish life. What is the church asking of us? What are the practical pastoral implications? And how can we get closer to this? How can we get closer to what the church asks of us? And I think the two things that come out of this particular talk would be getting back to the nature of the Mass, really talking about it, and also that there's an explanation from the priest, that he would explain when there isn't a change. Like we did catechize the people when we changed from, why do we have to say consubstantial now? Why can't we just say one and me? What a great opportunity to talk about it, whether we like it or not. At least it's an opportunity for catechesis. And hopefully that doesn't go missed. But I think so often when we make changes, it alienates people without explanation. And those are big changes. It's not like, we're changing hymns or something like that. You're talking about changing the language. You're talking about changing the direction of the spaces of Mass. And all those have to be explained very thoroughly.
So as musicians, can we mention that? I mean, do you think that's okay?
I think we have a perfect place. I mean, Absolutely, I think that you should be able to talk to your priest about that there's a lot of people who don't understand what this is. And then it's Father's fault. You've at least done your part. Well, that's all